The man who became the richest in California didn't forge his wealth with gold nuggets or with the sand of the rivers. His mine was where nobody was looking, on the counter of a tent shop between two pine boards, in plain sight of everyone and no one. And for a brief, fierce, impossible season, that store was worth more than all the gold coming out of the foothills, until it stopped being worth that much. The day that changed everything wasn't a discovery, it was a glass jar. Mid-May of 1848, on a street in Yerba Buena, a 29-year-old man was shaking a jar full of yellow dust as he walked between the warehouses. He shouted a single word over and over, as if the language had shrunk to just that: gold, gold from the American River. And the men who heard him, instead of laughing, set down their tools, buckled up their gear, and began walking east. The question very few asked themselves was, who was that man who had appeared with the inventory just when everyone needed it? That man was Samuel Brannan, and what he had just done wasn't madness. It was the boldest scheme anyone had ever set up on that coast, because Brannan wasn't possessed by the fever. He was a man creating the fever. To understand it, you have to go back a few months. Brannan had arrived in California in July of 1846, aboard the Brooklyn, with 238 Mormons he was leading toward a promised land that didn't yet exist. He had worked as a printer in the East. He was 27 years old and had no fortune. But something he did have, a nose for money that worked before the money showed up. In the fall of 1847, he opened a store at John Sutter's Fort, a remote outpost where commerce barely pulsed. And just then, the war between the United States and Mexico had ended. The army got rid of its surplus. Brannan bought them: picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, flour, coffee. He stored them with the patience of a hunter waiting for the stampede. Before the gold rush existed, Sam Brannan already existed, and he already had his arsenal. On March 25, 1848, his newspaper published a brief note about a gold find in New Helvetia. Nobody flinched. Brannan didn't either. He knew the fuse was already lit. In early May, he traveled to Coloma to see the gold with his own eyes. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected. He didn't stay to dig. He returned to San Francisco, made arrangements to open a second store, and executed the masterstroke. In mid-May, he walked through the streets shaking the jar. He shouted a single word, and within hours the city began to empty. Many abandoned their trades and homes to head for the mines. Yerba Buena was left practically deserted, though Brannan's store kept supplying those who were leaving. However, the fortune built on information asymmetry tends to wobble when the balance is restored. Brannan's story doesn't end here. It ends with another emptied city, that of his own fortune. Because the men marching toward the mines needed one thing before leaving. They needed what Brannan had stacked in his back room: picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, flour, coffee. All bought for pennies from an army that no longer wanted it, and Brannan sold it to them. Not at the market price, at the price of the fear of being left behind. The prices Brannan put on his tools didn't follow the logic of the market, but the logic of urgency. He set prices that turned a simple pick into a luxury item, and a sack of flour into a scarce and contested good. He ran one of the only stores between San Francisco and the gold fields. The real mine wasn't in the ground, it was on Brannan's counter. Brannan didn't sell gold, he sold the possibility of gold, and in a fever, possibility always costs more than the metal. In just a few months, he amassed a fortune no one had ever seen before on the West Coast. He bought lands that stretched down to Southern California and Hawaii. He became California's first millionaire. His empire did not come from the pan, but from the account book of a lonely store in the middle of nowhere. While the seekers enriched the legends, Brannan enriched his ledger. But gold has a cruel property. The gold that comes out of the earth changes everything but itself. And the men who are close to gold often end up further from it than when they started. In 1851, Brannan was disfellowshipped from the Mormon church that had brought him to California. The community he had helped establish on the coast rejected him. 2 years later, he was a state senator. But his empire was beginning to crack. Unpaid loans and bad investments drained his resources. By the time he left San Francisco, he did so with serious debts. The exit contrasted violently with the brilliance of that May afternoon when an entire city ran after his flask of gold. Approximately between 188 and 1887, Brannan took part in colonization and mining projects in the state of Sonora, Mexico. It was the same formula from decades earlier: untapped territory, resources to extract, a new frontier. But this time it did not work. Brannan, now elderly, tried to revive the magic of the trading post. But the frontier had changed. The surpluses were no longer in his hands. Now he was the miner who needed the tools, not the one who sold them. The money he earned there he used to pay the bills he had left in California. The man who once bought lands in Hawaii now needed income from Mexican mines to settle his debts. The difference between buying Hawaii and paying bills is the difference between an empire and a penance. It was a bitter end for the man who had been California's first millionaire. On May 5, 1889, Samuel Brannan died. The man who had ignited the gold rush died on a May 5th, the same month in which, 40 years earlier, he had raised the flask. He had unleashed the most massive migration in the continent's history, amassed a legendary fortune, and ended up working in Mexican mines to pay what he owed. The man who created a market for thousands of miners ended up selling his own capacity to work to settle debts. The image is hard to shake: a man standing on a wooden box in an empty street, waving a flask of yellow dust. In front of him, an open store, filled to the ceiling with what the others will need tomorrow. Behind him, an entire abandoned city, and in the pocket of his vest, a fortune that would last less than the fever that created it. The true gold mine was never in the river, it was always in the store. Brannan's tragedy was not that he failed to see it, it was that he saw it too soon, and believed that would be enough forever. Because in rushes, the true wealth is not extracted by those who dig, but by those who understand where the crowd is running. And Brannan understood it, but did not know how to hold on to it.